Ever find yourself looking at a huge company and just wondering, how do they even manage all the pieces, all the smaller companies they own?
It gets complicated fast, doesn't it? Especially when you look at their financial reports.
Exactly. So today, we're diving into that world consolidated financial statements. Specifically, how parent companies account for the businesses they control, their subsidiaries.
And there are, well, two main frameworks we need to unpack here for how control is viewed, particularly under U.S. GAAP.
Right, you've got the sort of traditional way, the voting interest model, think owning over 50% of the shares.
Uh-huh. And then there's the variable interest entity model, the VIE model, which is a bit more complex.
Our mission today is basically to clear up these ideas. What really matters when a company rolls up its subsidiaries into one big financial picture.
And it's interesting, because U.S. GAAP actually tells companies to look at the VIE model first.
Oh, really? Before the simple majority ownership.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah, because it's designed to catch situations where control exists even without owning more than half the votes. It's about economic substance, not just legal form.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's start with the voting interest model, maybe the one people are more familiar with. The basic idea is own more than half the voting stock, you consolidate.
Generally, yes. More than 50% usually equals control, so you combine their financials with yours. Pretty straightforward, most of the time.
But you said usually. Are there times when you own over 50% and you don't consolidate it?
There are. It's rare, but U.S. GAAP has exceptions.
Okay.
Like if the subsidiary is going through bankruptcy or some kind of legal reorganization,
Okay.
or maybe there are severe government restrictions in a foreign country that genuinely stop the parent from actually exercising control, even with the majority votes.
So the votes on paper don't always mean real control in practice. Got it. Now, you mentioned controlling versus non-controlling interests earlier.
Right. So if you own, say, 80%, that's your controlling interest. The other 20% that you don't own, that's the non-controlling interest, or NCI.
And how did that show up?
It's reported down the equity section of the consolidated balance sheet. It represents the slice of the subsidiary's net assets that belongs to those other outside owners, and it's measured at fair value.
Okay. So, back to this VIE model that comes first. What exactly is a variable interest entity? What makes it different?
Think of it like this. A VIE is an entity that lacks one of two key things. Either it doesn't have equity investors who have the usual voting rights and power to direct things, or it just doesn't have enough of its own financial resources, enough equity to support its activities without getting significant help from someone else, like guarantees or other support.
So it's dependent, financially speaking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It might be thinly capitalized or structured so the equity holders aren't really bearing the main risks or getting the main rewards.
And if you determine an entity as a VIE, who consolidates it then?
That responsibility falls to what's called the primary beneficiary.
The primary beneficiary.
Okay.
And that is?
That's the company that has both the power to direct the activities that most significantly impact the VIE's economic performance and the obligation to absorb the VIE's losses or the right to receive its benefits.
So power and economics, you need both.
You need both. It's about who's really calling the shots economically and who stands to gain or lose the most.
How does a company even know if they have a variable interest in the first place? What flags that?
Well, there needs to be some kind of arrangement or contract. The VIE itself has to be a legal entity, usually. It can't be one of the explicitly excluded types, like nonprofits or employee benefit plans.
Right.
Your interest has to be more than just insignificant. And crucially, you have to have exposure to the entity's variability, meaning you absorb losses or receive returns that change with the VI's performance.
Okay. And what are the specific situations where a business entity is flagged as a VIE?
Some key indicators are insufficient equity at risk. Like if the equity holders don't have enough skin in the game to absorb expected losses.
Like the little corporation example, needing that guarantee.
Precisely. Also, if the equity holders lack the power to direct the entity's most significant activities, or if they aren't obligated to absorb losses or entitled to receive returns, or, like in the Gertie Inc. case, if their voting rights are tiny compared to their economic interest, it suggests someone else is pulling the strings.
So the VIE rules really look past the simple share ownership to the economic reality.
That's the whole point, to get a clearer picture of control and risk.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. When one company does acquire control of another, How's that initial combination accounted for? I believe the term is the acquisition method.
Yes, exactly, the acquisition method. The parent company records the investment at the fair value of whatever they gave up cash, stock, other assets on the date the acquisition happens.
Like that Tag Inc. example, where the stock price mattered on the closing date, not before or after.
Exactly right. It's valued at that moment of exchange.
What are the sort of core principles of this acquisition method?
Two big things. First, you record 100% of the subsidiary's net assets, assets minus liabilities, at their fair values on the acquisition date, even if you only bought, say, 80%,
A whole thing gets revalued.
the whole thing. And second, the subsidiary's own equity accounts from before the acquisition, their common stock, retained earnings, all that they get completely eliminated in the consolidation, wiped clean.
Wow, okay, so there must be specific adjustments made on the consolidated worksheet then.
Oh, yeah. You eliminate the subs equity, you eliminate the parent's investment in subsidiary account, you establish the non-controlling interest if there is one, you adjust all the subs assets and liabilities to fair value.
Okay.
You also identify and record any intangible assets the sub had that weren't on its books, like brand names or customer lists, at fair value. And then typically, the leftover difference becomes goodwill.
Right, that CR acronym helps remember the eliminations, common stock, APIC, retained earnings.
That's a good way to think about the subsidiary equity elimination part, yes.
What if the deal includes potential future payments? Contingent consideration.
Good question. You estimate the fair value of that probable payment on the acquisition date, add it to the investment cost, and record a corresponding liability, like the big company example, needing to potentially pay $85,000 later.
And just for the parent's own internal books after the acquisition.
Internally, the parent will usually track that investment using either the cost method or the equity method, but that's just for their standalone records. It gets eliminated when they prepare the consolidated financials.
Right. And the non-controlling interest, how's that calculated after day one?
It starts with the fair value at acquisition date times the NCI percentage. Then, going forward, it's the beginning NCI balance, plus the NCI's share of the subsidiary's net income for the period, and minus the NCI's share of any dividends the subsidiary paid out.
Okay. And goodwill, we mentioned it. What does it really represent?
Goodwill is basically the purchase price component that you can't assign to any specific identifiable net asset. It's the excess of the subsidiary's overall fair value, implied by the purchase price, over the fair value of its identifiable net assets. Think brand reputation, synergies, skilled workforce, valuable stuff, but hard to pin down separately.
And sometimes there's no goodwill, or even a gain.
Yes, if the parent got a bargain, if the fair value of the net assets acquired is more than the price paid, the parent recognizes a gain on the acquisition date. And remember, there's usually a measurement period, up to a year, to finalize those fair value estimates. Adjustments during that time often tweak the goodwill amount, like in that Pathways Core example.
So putting it all together, really understanding these consolidated statements comes down to first figuring out control. Is it voting power, or is it this VIE economic substance test? And then knowing that when companies combine via acquisition, the acquired company's books are essentially reset to fair market value within the consolidated picture.
That's a great summary. And knowing this framework really helps you, as an observer or investor, understand the true size, scope, and financial health of these complex organizations that we see everywhere.
It gives you a lens to see beyond just the parent company's name.
Absolutely. Think about a big bank or a media conglomerate. Understanding how they consolidate, especially if VIEs are involved, can reveal hidden risks or dependencies that you wouldn't see otherwise. It changes how you might assess their overall stability.
Definitely food for thought. It adds another layer to understanding the business world around us.